Hey everybody, today we're going to learn about weathering and erosion. It's a multi-day lesson. Today we're going to focus on a form of weathering called physical weathering. First, let's go over the difference between weathering and erosion because a lot of times the words are used interchangeably. So my question is which of the following is a true statement? Here's statement A. There could be erosion without weathering. And here's statement B. There can be weathering without erosion. So which of those statements is true? A, there could be erosion without weathering, or B, there could be weathering without erosion. And the answer is B, there could be weathering without erosion. So let's go over the differences. So what's the difference between weathering and erosion? So weathering is the physical and chemical processes that break down rocks and minerals into sediment. So weathering makes things smaller. So it turns big things into smaller pieces. While erosion is the carrying away or the transport of weathered rock. All right? And that's why you can have weathering without erosion, because weathering could just break the rocks down. Erosion needs to move those broken rocks. So if I just take a hammer and break a rock, I just weathered it. But then if I throw the broken pieces, now I eroded it. All right? So that's the difference. Soil is something in which weathering is good for, but erosion is bad. Because weathering will make your soil thicker. It will break down rocks and make the soil grow. But erosion will take the soil away. So you want a nice balance. If you want a nice rich soil, you don't want too much erosion. You want more weathering. All right, there's two major types of weathering, physical and chemical. Just like last year in 7th grade science, there's physical reactions and chemical reactions. So a physical reaction is also called mechanical. So physical weathering is also referred to as mechanical weathering. And these are when rocks are physically or mechanically broken down into smaller pieces. So the example I gave earlier, if I break a rock with a hammer, that's a type of physical weathering. Now that doesn't really happen in nature. You don't have a hammer, all right, but you do have the ability for rocks to bang into other rocks. So in physical weathering, there's only a change in size and shape. And this is greatest in terms of rate and where the climate is wet and cold. So physical weathering will occur at the greatest rate where it's wet and cold. Chemical weathering is when there's a breakdown of rocks through chemical processes. This means the products are different from the reactants, which means what you end up with is different than what you started with. And this is greatest in wet, warm climates. So no matter what, weathering is greatest wherever you have a lot of water. See, they both have wet. Okay. So for the remaining part of this lesson, we're really going to go into agents of physical weathering, things that help physical weathering. And the first one is called freezing and thawing. This has a few different names. We also refer to it as frost action or ice wedging. So what happens is water will move into a tiny crack, and then that water overnight might freeze. And when water freezes, it expands, which means it's going to make that crack even bigger. And then when the sun rises, the water melts or thaws, and then it repeats the next day. So over an entire winter, one little hole might become a giant hole. And this has the ability to form potholes in our street. That's why in the Northeast where we live, every few years we have to repave the roads because of this type of physical weathering. And this also makes cliffs unstable, which this video is going to show. So ice freezes into that crack, it melts. Then it repeats the next day, and the crack gets bigger. And now it's really unstable that you can actually have a rock fall. So frost action or freezing and thawing can cause cliffs to be unstable as well. They can break rocks apart. Okay. Abrasion is another form of weathering. And this is kind of like the hammer that I mentioned, a hammer breaking a rock, except the hammer is like moving sand or pebbles. So rivers and wind can pick up sediment, and as that sediment moves, it bangs into other sediments. And the repeated collisions can actually weaken the rock and break it apart. So abrasion is the process of wearing away rock through the collision of particles. Okay, so if something is very hard and can wear something down, we call that material abrasive. So sand is very abrasive, which is why we can use it for sandpaper. So when you use sandpaper to smooth something out, you're actually doing a type of physical weathering called abrasion. So here's abrasion with wind. So wind with sand is blasting the side of a rock, wearing it down. Okay. We actually use sandblasting to sometimes clean buildings in Manhattan. Instead of just power washing, they'll actually blast sand to smooth things out. All right, heating and cooling is another form of physical weathering. So every day the sun rises, the earth heats up, and overnight it cools. Well, whenever something heats up, the material expands, and then whenever it cools, it contracts. So over thousands of years of expanding and contracting, expanding, and contracting, the rock can actually weaken. So heating and cooling, rocks crack through repeated expansion and contraction due to heating and cooling. So over time, the top layers of the rock can actually break apart, which we call exfoliation. Exfoliation is kind of when you shed your outer layer. All right, plant growth, which is probably one of the ones most of you see in your neighborhood, since we live in the suburbs and there's a lot of sidewalks. You ever notice when you ride your bike, roots can actually like lift the sidewalk? I know my kids love it because it makes a natural ramp for them to use on their bike. So roots can crack open rocks. So here we go, where the roots lifted up the sidewalk there. Okay. And here's just an image. So first you have the soil, plant grows in, and over time the plant can break apart the rocks. So this is something you're probably really familiar with in your neighborhood. All right, the last form of physical weathering is done by animals. So animals can move sediment. Okay, a prairie dog can create tunnels, and so could a groundhog. So they actually can move a decent amount of sediment, which is why they're a nuisance, to your backyard. If you have them in where you live, you're probably going to want to get rid of them because they're ripping apart all the land there. All right, but over time, they can actually move a lot of rock or break rock down. So they do play a role. All right. So tomorrow's lesson, we're going to go into chemical weathering. So that's it for today. All right. I hope you enjoyed it. All right. I'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.